Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alicia Cabrera. My major is political science, and the mentors that helped me today is Dr. Swan and Dr. Lavirga Humforti. Specifically, my topic is protecting indigenous populations in New Zealand, and the case study is on the Maori. So just to give you guys a kind of background on my topic, the Maori are the indigenous population of New Zealand. They make up approximately 14% of the actual population in New Zealand. And they have a treaty called the Treaty of Waitangi, which basically is the founding document that established most of their rights and is still used today currently as a guide for their rights. And then today the Maori unfortunately retain less than 5% of their actual land, and they have very high incarceration rates, high unemployment rates, low income rates, and low educational attainment rates. So my questions were 3. What challenges have the Maori faced as New Zealand's indigenous population? How does the Treaty of Waitangi and other policies seek to promote indigenous rights in New Zealand? And to what extent have those efforts protected their indigenous rights? So for my lit review, I specifically looked at 3 main things. One of it was the Treaty of Waitangi itself, because the treaty is actually riddled in misinterpretations because there's 2 versions. There's the British version and the Maori version. And of course, the dominant group is the group that is going to be believed more, and the version that is actually going to be taken into account better. And in this particular scenario, it's the British. So specifically, the treaty itself is it's just a very complex issue within it because it's still used, even though it had been signed in 1840. So it was a very long time ago, and it's still used today as a guide. And yet, we come to this problem. Another aspect that I looked at was assimilation, specifically in the educational aspect, because education was basically used as a tool in which to undermine the Maori cultural values and basically integrate these children and the goal was to actually Europeanize them. Another aspect that I looked at in my lit review was just the fact that how policy statements, specifically within education, showed how they were trying to set up the scene so that basically the Maori population could become the rural labor class for New Zealand. And that scene with just the limited educational attainments that they had, and just the scene of making it so they don't need that much education just so that they can be doing the labor things that don't really require a lot of thinking, but just the physical manual labor. The methods that I used was the historical and textual analysis. So I was just looking at the treaty specifically, and then I was also looking at New Zealand census. So I was looking at 4 indicators specifically while looking at the census. I was looking at unemployment, incarceration, income, and education. Those are all 4 very important indicators because they all show more or less how a society really treats its minority, and specifically to see the population and how they've been advancing or have yet to advance within the society itself. So a treaty analysis real quick. So I looked at just the pros and the cons within that, and there was again 2 different versions, and it was signed in 1840. For the Maori version, they retained their sovereignty and they thought that they would have full British citizen rights because when they first established the treaty was there so that they could be guaranteed rights and also so they could stop the feud between the British and the indigenous population of the Maori from continuing. So it was kind of like a compromise. For the British version, they thought that the Maori would be giving up their sovereignty, and in regards to that they would be giving up most of their land, and that they would not be treated as British citizens, and they wouldn't be granted their rights, but instead more or less the paternalism that came within the protection of the British Crown. And then something that is another con within the treaty itself was that it wasn't ratified. And this is so detrimental because the fact that it wasn't ratified made it so that it couldn't be enforced. So the Maori have always been very vulnerable just to changing political trends because some political, in the parliament specifically, because that's what they have, depending on the party that's there, some of them will actually support them more and others won't. And because the treaty cannot basically be enforced because it wasn't ratified, then it's just being continuously violated, which really leads to why they only retain about 5% of their land. And then I guess some pros would just be the fact that it's a founding document. It has a lot of historical meaning and importance. And it's still being used today just to kind of set out the guidelines of how these rights should be looked at. But another even more important question is just, okay, if we don't have the treaty, then what do we do now? Because it's been used for such a long time as just a guide in which they should be interpreting Maori rights because of just that historical context within it. Then it's kind of hard for people to think a way of like how we can do something else. This was my data. It looks a little crazy, but it's not. So a lot of it is just like different data that I've got from different census in New Zealand, specifically looking again like at the 4 indicators. And I specifically just wanted to see the comparison between the Maori and the European New Zealander and see specifically like compare where they were at in different levels, just to see where they are like in society. So for example, in their unemployment, from 2013 to 2016, for the Maori, the average unemployment rate for them in that year was 12.5, and whereas for the European New Zealander, it was 4.6%. So you see that that's a gap of 7.9%. In 2014, it was 11.8%, and then it went to 4.1%, and the gap is like 7.7, and so on. And you can see that technically it is like lowering a little bit. So you say, okay, there has been improvement, but it's so important to focus on the gap itself, because the gap is something that has just stayed as persistent. And it's the gap that needs to be addressed even more so. And you see that in the income as well. This was, again, like a census from New Zealand, and that's just like the hourly rate that they were making. And for the Maori, it's $18 compared to like 22.5. And you don't really think it's much, but then you start seeing it as a yearly income, and that's kind of when things add up. And you just see like that vast difference between them and just the gap that they're not at the same level. And then just even more so for incarceration rates. The Maori actually make up more than 50% of the incarcerated rate in New Zealand, even though they're only 14% of the actual population, which is absolutely ridiculous. And even more so in the education aspect as well. You can see how it's like 32, 32, 31, 32, and yet for the European New Zealanders, it's 52 and then 57 as well. So you can see that there's great disparities between both, and just by simply, literally, I just took like the raw data and got it from the census and just compared both. And you just see that difference, and you must know that there has to be like some type of inequality for that gap to just keep remaining. So kind of just elaborating on that, for the incarceration rate, again, it's just so crazy to think that these people make up approximately 14% of the population, but make up more than 50%. And most of it actually is young Maori men that make up that prison, that are in the prison population. And they've actually been pretty stagnant, like the rates, and even more so, they make up more than 20% compared to a European New Zealander. And it's just clear to see like that very significant disparity. For income, again, it's increased a bit for the Maori throughout the years, but again, it's still very persistent to see that there is a huge gap that has been remaining, and it has never really been addressed. For unemployment, it's basically like the same thing. There's just this huge gap between them, and it hasn't really done much. And a lot of it too, which was really interesting that I was seeing in the literature, was just to see how people were so quick to think that it's been better because it was worse, but just because something is better doesn't mean that it's already fixed, especially if you're comparing it to like the actual majority of the population, and you note that no, like, they're not at the same level as they should be. Again, for education, it was similar. It was approximately 20% of New Zealanders hold better percentage rate of educational attainment than that of the Maori. And then these are actually my recommendations, which I think was really interesting to know. So first of all, there should actually be more policies directed specifically for the Maori, because they have very specific needs. And you can't just put a cookie cutter, like, fits all type of situation. So for example, for the unemployment and income, there should be more economic development workshops that actually work with Maori individuals at a very local level, so that they can actually help them and help this population be employed and actually do a lot better societally. And another part, for incarceration rates, again, since most of them are actually young male Maori, then there should be like at-risk youth programs that can actually be helping these people. And for education, it's just different type of educational policies need to be implemented that have opportunities like scholarships and internships that can actually get these people their connection, especially because the Maori used to before be more rural, and now they are becoming more urbanized because they're actually being integrated more into New Zealand society. But if they're not integrated very well, given the actual tools and utilizing them in order to be able to actually integrate them, they won't succeed. And that's something that's very important that should be acknowledged. Even more so, just the fact that the findings themselves, I thought was so important, specifically education, because with education, it's so intersectional. Education helps everyone. And through education, people actually have more of a voice within like their own society. And that's something that's so important. And it's so sad and just detrimental to see how lacking it is within the Maori population compared to the New Zealand one. That's pretty much it. If you guys have any questions,
I'm sorry if I missed this, but can you elaborate a little bit more on how the education clinic was quantified?
Yes, education, and they were comparing high school for them. So the majority of them was like, they call it differently. They call it like L4, which is just like their educational attainments. And then they had it like through an average of like every year, like what the majority of the population had. And that's like how I got the census, which is right here.
So just number of years completed, basically.
Yeah, just like the percentage rate of like people who, in the census that they had that had like that 4 years of high school education.
Yeah. Is the I'm sorry if I pronounced it wrong, Maori?
Yeah.
Population live like in a clumps area, or are they kind of distributed around like within the British?
Well, they used to live more in like a rural area, but now they're a lot more urbanized, and a lot of it too is that they have a lot of intermarriage, which is something else that kind of, I mean, I didn't specifically talk about it within my own research, but it's something I would either like to see or just see more about, because a lot of like the intermarriage in itself kind of, I guess, strays away from like the problem, but it's also something that's like a very important factor, like intermarriage, and then just the fact that they're a younger population than like that of the British. Like most of the population within like the Maori are younger, like the average person is younger, and that kind of ties into different problems, like for example with incarceration, how they're young male Maori, so they're not like older but younger.
So I'm just listening to this and thinking about like marginalized groups across the world, like young black men in America,
Yeah.
Native Americans, and I'm just thinking about, is there something particular about this Maori population that kind of sets them apart from other marginalized groups, or are there things that you see from other parts of the world where we're trying to sort of bridge that gap between these marginalized populations and their sort of, I don't want to say oppressor, but like oppressor populations to like help that might be able to like work in the Maori New Zealand situation?
There's actually this report that I just absolutely love that I did in my lib review that talked about specifically, it was a comparison within like what they labeled as 4 world countries, where it was like specifically comparing Native Americans in like America, and then also talking about the Maori in New Zealand. It was talking about like just the same type of struggles, but then the different sense of like how they actually had like implementation. For example, like for Native Americans, their sovereignty issue is different to those that are in New Zealand. Because like in New Zealand, technically, like because the Treaty of Waitangi is so vague, it kind of, what it does is that since it's so vague, the people who are in control, who technically would be like the majority, the dominant group, which is the European New Zealander group, are the ones that basically were able to like enforce the treaty's version of theirs, which basically said that the Maori didn't retain their sovereignty. And that's what led to like their land removal in different aspects. But for Native Americans here, it's different. Just like the legal system itself is different within like tribes, and just like the rights as well is like different. But they're talking about like similar struggles as well, and you see that with like our own like, you know, police department, how most of the actual, you know, people who are in prison tend to be more people of color rather than like what you would say like your white person. And you kind of see like this different type of, I guess, how indigenous populations have been treated and how they have, even if they have like the Treaty of Waitangi, that doesn't really ensure their protection if it's going to be not enforceable and if it's going to be continually violated.
I was wondering if you had time to look at any policies from the government of New Zealand about education of the Maori population. Because in the information that you presented with the two different, what is it, like the 3D, the British version and the native version, right? One of the concerns that they have is assimilation.
Yes.
So if you have, if the books and the education that you are receiving are Western influenced and you are from this indigenous population, you might be concerned about having that part of assimilation process, right?
Yes.
So I'm wondering if, you know, when you think, yes, this population has to be more educated, the problem is if they are imposed this particular type of culture, they may not want to do that, right?
Yeah.
If I could build on that
Yeah.
point, I think part of what we need to talk about, and I would encourage you to consider this in your literature review, is the difference between assimilation and acculturation.
Mhm.
Assimilation assumes that the person, that you basically want to wipe out any kind of cultural indigenous difference within that population. And that's not what people want. That's not what these immigrant populations or these native indigenous populations want. They want to retain their culture and heritage, retain their languages, retain their culture, but also be incorporated into these new societies. So I would really encourage you, as you unpack your literature review, to talk about the two differences between assimilation and acculturation, and which goals that these immigrant or minority groups are actually striving for.
I actually did look a little bit within like the language retention rate, and I saw that most of the language retention rate, the percentage rate of them holding the language was younger. So if they were younger, then they usually held on more to it. And it was just that, like once they got into school, they like lost more like within that language. But even so, like in the lit review about like the assimilation specifically, that was like kind of more towards like the beginning, and they were talking about specifically the education that they were being implemented, and it was actually really interesting because they were talking about how a lot of it too was just like they wanted them to assimilate more so that they could be like Europeanized, but at the same time, like they created something called the native schools, and the native schools were used to intend basically for them to be segregated, and then once they reached the level of Europeanization, that they were going to go to the other schools where like the other children that were European New Zealanders were basically going to. But in itself, it was really hard as well, just because they didn't fund the schools. They even wanted like the Maori population to be paying for those schools as well. And then also a lot of the chiefs within like the indigenous population said that they weren't being given the actual educational tools in order for them to even thrive like in the actual society of like the European New Zealanders. So it became like a very interesting issue within that aspect. But it was very interesting just to read about it and know more about the education within like the marginalization of this population. And yeah, and just the fact that they should be retaining that heritage that they should be very proud of.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.